Margaret Whitmore owned one of the largest estates in Westchester County, the kind of home people slowed their cars to stare at: white columns, manicured hedges, iron gates that whispered wealth without apology. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, and Persian rugs muted every footstep. Yet every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Margaret sat alone at the long dining table designed to seat 12. The room echoed with silence. Silverware was arranged perfectly. A single plate was placed at the head of the table. The staff had long since learned not to speak unless spoken to, and even then, only briefly. Margaret Whitmore was a widow. Her husband, Charles Whitmore, had built a financial empire from nothing. They had shared 32 years of marriage, countless charity galas, and a lifestyle few could imagine. But when Charles died suddenly of a heart attack, the house didn't just lose a man, it lost its voice. Margaret had everything money could buy. Luxury cars sat unused in the garage, closets overflowed with designer clothes she no longer wore. Invitations to elite social events arrived weekly, unopened, but loneliness was immune to wealth. She ate in silence, slept in silence, woke to silence. Her children were grown, scattered across the country, busy with lives fueled by the same ambition their father had lived by. Phone calls became holidays only. And so Margaret filled her days with routine: breakfast at 7, charity board meetings twice a week, and dinner alone at 6, always alone. The agency sent Rosa Johnson on a Tuesday. Margaret hadn't asked for a nanny, not really, but her doctor had insisted she needed daily assistance after a fainting episode. Rosa was calm, soft-spoken, and efficient, a black woman in her early 30s. She dressed modestly and spoke respectfully. She was hired to help with light housekeeping and meal preparation, nothing more. Rosa never sat down, never overstepped, never spoke unless asked, and Margaret barely noticed her, until one afternoon, laughter echoed through the hallway. Margaret froze mid-step. Laughter. It was high-pitched, bright, alive. She followed the sound to the sunroom where Rosa stood holding the hand of a young boy about 7 years old, eyes sparkling, energy impossible to contain. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," Rosa said quickly. "This is my son, Daniel. His school closed early. I didn't mean to disturb." Margaret stared at the child. He smiled. "Hi," Daniel said cheerfully. "Your house is huge." No one had spoken to Margaret like that in years. Something inside her shifted. Margaret should have dismissed them. She didn't. Instead, she heard herself say, "It's fine." Daniel wandered around the room, fascinated by the piano no one played anymore. "Do you live here all by yourself?" he asked innocently. Rosa gasped. "Daniel, yes," Margaret answered softly. "I do." Daniel tilted his head. "That sounds lonely." Margaret swallowed. That evening, Margaret sat at her dining table as usual. But when the soup was served, she hesitated. "Rosa," she said suddenly, "does your son eat yet?" Rosa looked confused. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret nodded. "Then bring him." Rosa's eyes widened. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't this please," Margaret said quietly. For the first time in years, the long dining table had more than one plate. Daniel climbed into the chair, legs swinging. "This is fancy," he whispered. Margaret smiled for the first time in months. Daniel talked through the entire meal, about school, about airplanes, about how his mom made the best pancakes in the world. Margaret listened, really listened. She found herself laughing an unfamiliar sound that surprised even her. The walls didn't echo anymore. They absorbed warmth. Days turned into weeks. Daniel visited often. Margaret began asking about his homework, his dreams, his favorite books. She learned Rosa was raising him alone after her husband passed away in a workplace accident. Margaret recognized that pain, loss had many faces, but the ache was the same. Slowly. The empty chairs felt less intimidating. Not everyone approved. At a charity luncheon, one board member leaned in. "Margaret, people are talking, having staff's children around." Margaret cut her off. "Then let them talk." She had spent decades caring what people thought. Now she cared about laughter. One evening Margaret collapsed. This time, it was serious. She woke in a hospital room, disoriented. The first face she saw wasn't a doctor, it was Daniel's. "Don't worry," he said. "I told them you're not done eating dinner with us yet." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Recovery was slow, but Rosa and Daniel visited every day. Margaret made a decision. She updated her will. Not because of money, but because of meaning. She set up a trust for Daniel's education. She funded a scholarship in Rosa's name, but more importantly, she opened her home. Months later, the dining room looked different, not in decor but in life. Art projects lay on the table. Laughter replaced silence. Conversations filled the air. Margaret still sat at the head, but she was no longer alone. She looked at Daniel one evening and said, You saved me. He shook his head. You just needed someone to eat with. Margaret Whitmore was still rich, but not in the way people assumed. She was rich in presence, in purpose, in family, and every night at 6 o'clock, the table filled, not with silver, but with laughter.